sexy guys do. Explore what's soul in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, the question for this week is something that's been rattling around in my brain for quite a while. It's one of those things that you read something and you're like, that's interesting, kind of concerning, but you don't really follow up on it, but it's there in the back of your head. And it's that I read maybe a couple of years ago that the average American has $4,000 in savings. And of course, average can be a deceptive figure. They didn't say how old the average American was, like how much time they have left to save. But it did pose for me this kind of terrifying scenario that maybe cost of living, cost of housing, all those things have created an environment where it is so difficult to save for retirement that retirement might become impossible for an entire generation of Americans because they will need to pay for things like food and housing and rising healthcare costs, and they will not have money saved away to do that. So this is a loop that I would love to close for myself of figuring out whether or not this is in fact a problem that we should be concerned about. So I handed it over to you with the question, is that $4,000 in savings figure accurate or a little bit deceptive? And are we in fact headed for a demographic retirement disaster? So what did you find?
Yeah, boy, it's an excellent question. And one thing I just want to say right off is that it's in the news right now. Just this morning, I read in the New York Times that one of the results of the Trump administration's scary message to all the civil servants about how you could take this retirement offer and get out in a few months and we'll pay you, right? But everybody else is not guaranteed a job beyond that. An important subtext of that coverage in the paper was the savings that all these civil servants have accrued over their careers and whether they have enough to save and they don't. And a lot of people are scared. So this topic is most certainly in the news literally today, but generally speaking too. So I'm glad you asked this question.
Great.
I want to start by ringing our red alert klaxon. So let's do that. The red alert is a warning that you're going to hear a lot of numbers and percentages in this episode. I tried to think about how to do this without a mind-numbing focus on numbers, but there's really no way to sensibly discuss a topic like this without marinating in statistics. So I'm going to try my best to make sense of it as we go along. Okay, so job one is to fact-check that statistic you mentioned in your question. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances published in 2022, which is the most recent year for which we have data, the typical American has about $8,000 in the bank. It's double the number you cited, but it's still pretty dismal.
Yeah.
I'm referring now to the median transaction account balance, and I want to define that term. The median, you know this already, is the value above and below which there are an equal number of values. In other words, right smack in the middle.
Yeah.
But a transaction account comprises people's savings, checking, money market, call accounts, and prepaid debit cards. By contrast, the mean or average balance in American transaction accounts is $62,410. But that number skews high because of the very rich people with much larger balances. The median of $8,000 is a much better indicator of how much money most Americans have saved. And to that point, wherever possible, I'm going to use medians instead of averages. I'm also going to focus wherever I can on people in their 50s and 60s as opposed to all ages, since how much savings young adults have as they start their careers is less germane to your question.
Right, yeah.
Okay, moving along. Research conducted by the Federal Reserve is probably the gold standard here for trustworthiness. And I say that because once I started looking at non-Fed sources, I came across a wider range of numbers. For example, according to the insurance company Northwestern Mutual, 42% of Americans have no personal savings, which is truly frightening.
Yeah.
A November 2023 survey from the personal finance website Go Banking Rates indicated that nearly half of Americans have $500 or less in their savings accounts. Another 29% have between $501 and $5,000, and the remaining 21% of Americans have more than $5,000. Forbes Advisor ran its own survey, finding that more than a quarter of Americans have savings below $1,000. Despite all that noise in the data, the through line, I think it's fair to say, is that many American households are in desperate straits when it comes to savings and their ability to weather financial storms.
Right. And for my clarity on these figures, if you're talking savings, if say a person has $5,000 savings, but they owe $50,000 on their house, would they be in this survey as a $5,000 savings person or a negative 45,000 net person?
They would be in the servings as a 5,000 savings person. Yes.
Okay.
This is irrespective of your financial position in other walks of life. And I'm going to talk about those other walks of life as we go along. So that's a good question. The 2022 Fed study diced the numbers by age, race, education, and net worth. And the result is what you'd expect. The apex for median savings is for the age group 65 to 74, which has $13,400. While people under 35 have $5,400. The median for white Americans is $12,000, while blacks and Hispanics have about $2,100 each.
Ish.
Yeah. Education is closely correlated with savings. Americans without a high school diploma have a median balance of only $900. Those with only a high school diploma have $3,030. Those with some college have $5,200. And those with a bachelor's degree have $23,370. So you see the educational divide there, and that might seem stark, but it's nothing compared to net worth, which is defined as assets minus debt. This is where America's vast, unconscionable inequality is laid bare. Americans in the top 10th percentile of net worth have a median balance of $128,000, which is more than 5 times that of people in the 75th to 89th percentile, and 128 times that of folks in the bottom quartile of net worth. The next survey of consumer finances is coming this year, and with political power now in the hands of the oligarchs, I doubt we'll see any moderation of these numbers.
Right. And continue the fine American tradition of blaming poverty on the poor.
Yeah. When it comes to emergency preparedness, the news is equally grim. Bankrate's Financial Freedom Survey indicated that in both 2023 and 2024, 36% of American adults had more credit card debt than money saved in an emergency fund. The 2022 Fed study found that only 45% of Americans can cover a $400 expense with money from their checking or savings accounts, while another study reports that only 54% of Americans have enough savings to cover the 3 months of expenses that most financial planners say is the minimum balance necessary for an emergency fund.
Yeah.
These are bleak numbers, and they don't get any less bleak as I go along. The amount of money that people should keep in a savings account depends on their income and expenses, but it's generally a good idea to sock away at least 15% of your pre-tax income for the proverbial rainy day. The dearth of savings represented by all those numbers I just cited strongly suggests that millions of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, forced to rely on high-interest credit cards to tide them over when faced with the unexpected expenses or crises that happen to every household.
Yeah.
Of course, taking on too much credit card debt can lead to a cycle of interest and repayment charges that can be damn near impossible to escape. I have personal experience with this, stemming from a trip to London I took in the early 1990s. I didn't have the cash to pay for it, so I charged the whole thing. A few years later, I was still paying back the obscenely high interest, and it barely made a dent in the principal. And it wasn't until I met my wife and we pooled our finances that I was finally able to get out from under that debt.
Yeah.
Americans used to be known as optimists, hopeful about most everything, including their financial futures. Not anymore, it seems. According to Bankrate's 2024 Financial Freedom Survey, only 22% of Americans report that they're either already making enough money or believe they'll one day earn enough to feel financially secure, whereas 49%, more than double, think it's either unlikely or impossible that they'll ever get there.
Yeah.
The naysayer skepticism is well-founded. For one thing, prices for many staple goods are about 20% higher since the pandemic. As you may have heard, the cost of eggs is through the roof right now due to the bird flu. Using Redfin data on home prices, a Bankrate analysis found that the median priced home in the USA costs $402,343, and to afford it, you need an annual income of $110,871. Yes, it now takes a six-figure salary just to afford a typical American home. That's up 46% since the start of 2020, when the pandemic led to a spike in inflation. Now notice that I haven't mentioned the word retirement yet. Thus far, I've been speaking about transaction accounts, the money that people rely on from day to day. And as you've heard, that situation is bad enough. But it goes from bad to worse when we consider retirement savings. A survey conducted by the audit consulting company PwC reports that only 36% of Americans think their retirement planning is on track. With the median retirement savings account at $120,000 for the age cohort approaching retirement, that's people aged 55 to 64, PwC estimates that the median retiree will probably receive less than $1,000 a month over a 15-year period before their nest egg is exhausted. That's no match for skyrocketing healthcare costs. And when you consider that according to the CDC's National Center of Health Statistics, the life expectancy for American men and women who make it to age 65 is 19.6 years. The median retiree's 15-year plan will leave them indigent at the end of life. Remember that I'm using median numbers instead of averages because they better reflect the lived experience of most Americans. But even that median retirement savings figure of $120K is arguably misleading when you consider these two facts. First, 2/3 of the American labor force work at companies that don't even offer a retirement plan. Second, according to the same 2022 Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances that I cited earlier, 17% of Americans aged 45 to 59 and 13% of Americans aged 60 plus have no savings whatsoever in retirement accounts. And I just want to define retirement accounts because I defined transaction accounts a minute ago. Retirement accounts are defined as IRAs, Keogh accounts, pensions, thrift savings accounts, and employer-sponsored 401k and 403b accounts. If the median retiree with her measly 120k has little to no chance of making ends meet, what kind of outcome awaits the retiree who has nothing saved?
Exactly. That was the concern at the heart of my question. So I love that we're getting to this.
Yes. Now, in fairness, transaction accounts and retirement accounts, the two buckets I've already described, are not the only places where people have financial assets they might use for a rainy day. There are also investments like stocks, bonds, and certificates of deposit, as well as non-liquid assets that would have to be sold for income, like a home, a car, or jewelry. When you factor in all those other sources that contribute to a person's net worth, about 65 to 70% of Americans approaching retirement age have at least 100K. Sounds good, right? But I just explained how a retirement account with 120K in it disperses only $1,000 per month for 15 years. Unless you're planning to lead a monastic life in retirement, you're going to need a lot more than that. As for how much more, a couple of common rules of thumb are to aim for an amount that's about 10 times your final annual salary, or to replace around 80% of your household's pre-retirement income in retirement. Those are thresholds that most Americans of retirement age are nowhere near approaching.
Yeah, not even ballpark.
Right. So there's one revenue source that we haven't discussed yet. You know which one I'm talking about, Mark? I'll give you 2 hints. It's not bank robbery, and it's not selling your children for medical experiments.
So taking 2 good options off the table.
It's Social Security. Millions of Americans are overly reliant on it to meet their needs in retirement. The sobering truth is that the average annual Social Security benefit, based on figures I obtained from the Social Security Administration this month, is $23,712. That's what you can expect per year. I couldn't find a median for this figure, so we have to settle for the average. It's that number, 23 grand and change, is above the federal poverty line for an individual, which is $14,500, but not by very much. And it's below the poverty line for a family.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. Social Security is a wonderful program that backstops senior citizens' finances and undoubtedly saves lives in so doing, but it's not a panacea for retirement.
Particularly since it could tip into insolvency at any point.
Yes, that's a good mansplaining topic for a future podcast. Entitlements in general and whether they're going to remain solvent. Okay, I want to pivot now to a question you didn't ask me, but I kept asking myself as I went along in my research. So I want to present this to you because I think it's interesting. The question of why are so many Americans so woefully unable to save money?
Right.
Behavioral psychology offers a clue. People are bad at saving because they're bad at planning for anything in the distant future when there are so many distractions and temptations in the here and now. We're taping this episode on the last day of January. Think about how many people are already falling short on their New Year's resolutions, made just a few weeks ago, to lose weight or quit smoking or save more money. Why save for the decades ahead when you can spend and enjoy your money now? Even so, among developed nations at least, Americans are uniquely bad at saving. Though it's true that savings rates have fallen in other first world countries like Germany, Japan, and Canada, the U.S. is still an outlier in how ill prepared most of its people are for retirement.
Yeah. I'm happy to say that I personally am an outlier that because I went through a sort of scarring period in my childhood that made me very afraid of running out of money. And so I save compulsively to the point that it negatively impacts quality of life. So it's not necessarily something I brag about.
Yeah.
But within the culture that we live in, you almost need a psychological problem to drive you to save because everything else
Yes.
within our popular culture is encouraging you to spend.
Yeah. I want to say two things about that. The first is I'm like you. My wife and I have been very frugal, and instead of taking a lot of vacations, we stayed right at home for a lot of time and thus have been able to put more money into our retirement savings. So it's in better shape than most people. But the second thing is my parents' generation, I suspect this is your parents too, the so-called silent generation. They grew up during the Great Depression immediately thereafter, and their childhoods were characterized by the lack of plenty and scarcity, So they grew
Mhm.
up with an intense saving ethic, whereas the subsequent generations that grew up in a much more robust and healthy, economically thriving country, I don't think had that natural inclination to save.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely that was true of my father and his father before them, that they went through severe hard times. They had a farm at one point in Kansas that failed, and so they had to put all their belongings in a car and just drive to the West
Yeah.
Coast to find some way to live. And both of them came out of that with an inability to spend a single dime that wasn't absolutely necessary because of that fear you can never get away from, that at some point you're not going to have enough.
Right.
With minds like steel traps, walking door here to the sun. The interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain it. It's a calling that you don't do it too.
But that psychological answer is too easy because it doesn't explain the arc of savings in recent decades. Americans used to save more, as we were just saying to each other. Top earners have always saved money. Today, the top 1% save more than half their income. But in the 1970s, even the average American household saved 12% of its income, which falls short of the minimum 15% recommended by financial planners, but is at least within shouting distance. By 2006, the savings rate for the bottom 90% of households was close to negative 10%, which means that 90% of the population was spending nearly 10% more than it earned.
Ugh.
Today, the overall savings rate is about 4.4%, positive 4.4%. But again, that's an average that includes all those high earners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In 2016, Derek Thompson wrote an illuminating piece in The Atlantic in which he proposed 5 other theories for why Americans seem incapable of saving. So we put aside the psychological explanation. Here are some other possibilities. One was that Americans stopped saving when wages stagnated and more of their money was diverted to cover rising expenses, with the result that they no longer made enough money to be able to save anything. There's some evidence for this. Between 1960 and 1973, real per capita income grew annually at a 3.2% clip. But in the 2 decades after that, the growth rate was only 1.5%. That's less than inflation. But wage stagnation explains only the beginning of the decline of savings. We know that because during the Clinton presidency in the 1990s, gains in real income again surpassed inflation, while personal savings continued to fall by more than 5%.
Huh.
Thompson's second theory involves home ownership rates, which had stagnated in the 1980s and early 1990s, but rose sharply after that. Mortgage debt skyrocketed in the 1990s and didn't crest until the housing bubble burst during the Great Recession in 2009. Fueled by easy credit availability, subprime mortgages, and the like, the savings rate of the bottom 90% of households turned negative in 1998 as many Americans invested their wage gains in real estate. And of course, after the housing market went belly up, millions of people were saddled with underwater mortgages or faced foreclosure, which was a disaster for anyone who used their savings to buy a house.
Yeah.
Thompson's third theory relies less on economic trends than on the vagaries of U.S. government policies, which disincentivize saving money. Take retirement plans. Most employers used to provide people with defined benefit plans, also known as pensions, where the employee knew how much money he'd get when he retired. Nowadays, employers opt for defined contribution plans like 401ks and 403bs, where the employee knows only how much she's putting away for retirement each year. Defined contribution plans also build in the so-called flexibility to borrow against your retirement earnings, a privilege that's abused by American employees to the tune of 40 cents of each invested dollar being withdrawn prematurely. Other rich countries place much greater restrictions on early withdrawals, so it should come as no surprise that they perform better in measures like the Global Retirement Index, where in 2024, the USA ranked 22nd, down 2 spots from the year before. Incidentally, that same report says that 47% of working Americans now believe it will take a miracle for them to achieve retirement security.
Yeah.
Our policies essentially make it easy to borrow and spend, including by raiding our meager retirement savings so we can borrow and spend some more. Thompson's fourth and fifth theories offer cultural explanations. The fourth borrows from a column Megan McArdle wrote for the Daily Beast in 2013 that centers on the allure of conspicuous consumption. There is social science research suggesting that some conspicuous consumption disproportionately affects the low-income, low-status people who can least afford it. McArdle's column noted how lower-income people feel pressured to purchase high-status items like jewelry, expensive sneakers, a flat-screen TV, or the new iPhone to signal that they're not poor. Quote, "If you're a member of an identifiable demographic with low average incomes, Southern, racial minority, rural, you are likely to be treated as if you are poor," end quote. And that makes it tougher to get work and social respect. Derek Thompson posits that, quote, "In a diverse country where some demographic groups are stereotyped as poor, lower income people might be more likely to pay for clothes and cars that say, 'I'm not who you think I am,'" end quote.
Yeah. That makes me think of a short story I read back when I was in middle school called Not Poor, Just Broke. And it was the author's memoir of when he was in school and received a bright orange jacket for the winter because they were a lower income. He threw it away and his mother was so angry at him. But he was ashamed to be wearing a jacket that signaled that he and his family were poor. And in his mind, they weren't poor, they were just broke. So it's kind of the flip side of that. You can't afford that iPhone, but you want to have the iPhone to signal that, yeah, I'm broke, but I'm not poor.
Yeah, I know that story because I read it to my kids. So yeah, that's exactly the point. So then there's Thompson's fifth theory, which mentions how income inequality exacerbates everything we've been talking about. And he cites studies that link the falling savings rate with rising inequality as economically struggling households try desperately and fruitlessly to keep up with the Joneses. Quote, "When people see others living the high life, they try to buy it for themselves, even when they can't afford it," end quote. Some
Mhm.
scholars have dubbed this phenomenon trickle-down consumption. Thompson connects his last two theories thusly, quote, perhaps it's precisely because American policy has embraced free markets over egalitarianism that many Americans spend more to signal their prosperity, to separate themselves from their peer groups, and to show that they are better than equal, end quote. Gives new meaning to the expression freedom ain't free, doesn't it?
Yeah, certainly. And it explains the phenomenon you'll see on social media and sometimes in real life of people with ostentatiously flashy cars, where clearly that's a bigger car than they can really afford to drive. It's trickle down consumption, like you say. I see the people I admire driving this car, so I want to drive it too in order to signal that I am in some way a member of that community.
Yes. Okay, here's another question you didn't ask me, but I want to say something about it. You didn't ask how we can get Americans to save more money. So I didn't spend much time on this question, but for the sake of completeness, I want to offer a few ideas. Some politicians have long advocated for raising the minimum wage and promoting financial literacy as methods to give lower skilled workers more money to save and a better idea how to save it. There are more targeted options like employing behavioral nudges, such as switching retirement plans from opt-in to an automatic enrollment with opt-out.
Yeah.
Or we could go the full paternalistic route by instituting forced savings policies, essentially taking money away from our younger selves to ensure the well-being of our older selves. That would be a heavy lift in the myopic culture we live in today, but maybe someday?
Yeah, maybe. I can imagine the uproar of a younger population that's already struggling with student loan debt and not being allowed to keep every dollar that they earned because a paternalistic government is telling them that they'll need that dollar more later. I could understand where that would be rage-inducing.
Yeah, you're right. It's probably not realistic. But behavioral nudges are gaining in popularity these days.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it makes fiscal sense to employ them, so they might be the best way to go. Okay, to your ultimate question about whether Americans' lack of savings is a demographic disaster waiting to happen, I think the best answer is yes, with an asterisk. Yes, it's unquestionably a disaster. We live in a consumerist society where people are addicted to spending beyond their means, and the story doesn't end well for many of those people, especially now that they live much longer than they used to. Americans are delusional about a lot of things. Cynicism about their own prospects in retirement is not one of them. But here's the asterisk. This isn't a new phenomenon. As we pointed out in our Reasons for Hope episode earlier this month, for millennia before the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the lot in life for most humans was to live in abject poverty. Even in the 20th century, amidst the greatest explosion of global wealth the world had ever seen, billions of people were still destitute. Here in America, we needed to invent Social Security just to keep Grandma from hawking her wedding ring and living on cat food in her dotage. So how will people with no retirement savings make do in retirement? By doing many of the things they're already doing. They'll keep working till they drop. They'll max out their credit cards. They'll rely on Social Security and younger family members for cash assistance or a place to live. If they reach the limit of their credit card debt, or if they don't have children or other close relatives to bail them out, they'll go on Medicaid and live in poverty. If the oligarchs zero out Medicaid funding or start chipping away at entitlements like Medicare or Social Security, many senior citizens may end up homeless or worse. Though I don't think that last thing is likely to happen because the constituency for universal entitlements in this country is huge and bipartisan. So does that sound about right, Mark?
Yeah, it sounds about right. As you were speaking, I was thinking of one sort of overarching topic, which I think we've encountered a few times on this podcast, which is our tendency to think that historically recent events are eternal and that need to continue forever. It certainly came up within our Future of Newspapers episode, and it's come up in a few other things where things that were just a feature of the 20th century might simply have been a feature of the 20th century. And like you said, there have been long stretches of human history in which retirement did not exist, where you worked until you could not get out of bed in the morning, and then shortly after that you would die. And that was just the human condition, is that you kept working as long as you could. And the notion that there should be golden years at the end of your career where you get to enjoy the fruit of your labors and travel and move to Florida and spend time with grandchildren, that may be something that had a beginning, a middle, and an end in retrospect. It could be that that's the way things are turning out. But my second thought on that topic is that in previous periods when people did work until they died, they were doing so within economies that provided positions for them to do so. And I wonder if the modern capitalistic society is going to provide enough positions for all the elderly people who need to work. Because I certainly have seen in my own experience doors closing within the professional world once you reach a certain age. And I know that there's an expectation within businesses that they might not have a mandatory retirement age, but still, once you hit a certain age, you're no longer a part of that company's future, and they would like you to move on, give you the gold watch and throw you a party and urge you to leave. And so if we are on a mass scale going to have people in their 70s and 80s and even 90s needing to bring home enough money at least to pay for milk and eggs, are there going to be enough paying positions for all those people when our economy has decades of history in which those people were not expected to be part of the workforce?
Okay, you're making two really profound points here, so I want to take them one at a time. To your second point about how the modern capitalism, whether it's going to provide enough positions for all the elderly people who need to work, I don't feel qualified to answer that question. These trends are just happening as we speak, and we're living it right now. I will say that you and I have recently experienced layoffs around our threshold of our retirement years. So this is a very real phenomenon that there might not be enough jobs for all the people who need to work due to their paltry savings.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to go back to your first point because I think it's really fascinating about how we mistakenly believe that recent norms are eternal. I forgot how you put it, like that the 20th century might just have been the 20th century. I think there's a lot to that statement. I feel like the post-World War II New Deal ideology may just have been a blip on the historical screen, because it seems in the 21st century, we're now entering into a period of backlash where we have reactionaries in power. And, something that our parents or grandparents grew accustomed to, comfortable retirement, may be a thing of the past now. Mm-hmm. A vestige of a very brief time in the mid to late 20th century when things were better, where people's welfare wasn't a zero-sum game as it appears to be now. I think there's a lot to that.
It's bringing to mind something that I was reflecting on earlier this week in a completely different strand of thought, which is that a growth industry for the future, in my mind, I make it a prediction right here, is post-career counselor, where a career counselor helps college kids figure out they're going to take that BA in philosophy and how are they going to turn it into a job. Post-career counseling, I think, is the growth industry where it's helping people transition from a career into what comes next. And what comes next is not taking it easy because you still need to be bringing home an income, but you can't do it the old way. You might not be able to do it in an office. And what does that mean?
Hey, I know you're being pessimistic in predicting that a post-career counselor might be the growth industry of the future, but I actually think you might be too sanguine in that prediction. The way things are going now, counselor for a suicide hotline might be the true growth industry of the future.
Suicide facilitator?
I didn't say suicide facilitator, Mark, though that could also be a growth industry in the future. I was just thinking about people counseling people who are suicidal and talking them off the ledge.
Yeah, talking them down from it. Yeah. I do definitely feel like in multiple ways, from various different directions, we are headed for upheaval. And some of those things will be for the good and some of those things will be for the bad, but we are in for one hell of a ride over the next few decades. I really believe that.
Yeah, it's hard not to think of the next few decades as a shit show in the making. And just to go back to the first point we made in this podcast, the median American has a whopping $8,000 saved for all the slings and arrows that are coming his way.
Yeah.
Not good.
Okay, well, this is one of our most bleak episodes, but thank you for that. It was exactly the answer I was looking for, so thank you for digging into it and come back to me with an answer.
Okay, you ready for your question for next time?
Okay.
Let's change the subject. So this is a topic I've had on my list for a long time, but in my research for this episode about saving, I read something that inspired me to finally ask you about it. Here's what I read. In 2014, state lotteries were a $70 billion business. People spent more money that year purchasing lottery tickets than everyone in the country spent on books, video games, recorded music, tickets for movies, and tickets for sporting events combined.
Wow.
The lottery is a double-edged sword. It's disproportionately funded by the poorest third of households, which buy half of all lotto tickets instead of placing their money in savings accounts. But its revenue is directed at unquestionably good things like public education.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mark, I want you to look at the pros and cons and come back with an answer to this question. On balance, are lotteries justifiable?
Okay, that'll be an interesting one. It's one of those topics that are good because everyone has some personal story to tell about a lottery or someone they knew buying lottery tickets. And yeah, it's also, as you say, something with national import. So it's both large scale and small scale. So I look forward to digging into that one.
Yeah, it's really sad to think about all the people struggling to make ends meet, and yet they're plunking away dozens or hundreds of dollars a month on lottery tickets.
Yeah. And so many people, and I've witnessed these people in the act who do not have enough money. And that's why they buy lottery tickets, because they see that as their only way out of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're looking for big changes in their life, so they're willing to try out that high risk, high reward lottery ticket rather than the low risk, low reward savings account.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll dig into that. We'll spend a couple of weeks on that. Come back to you with an answer. In the meantime, I encourage our listeners to give their loved ones a hug and put a little bit of money away for the future, because that dollar will be very helpful when you're sick and old. And with that, we will bring this episode to a close. But first, I want to alert our listeners to an update. And it's an update which came to us by way of a listener. I met with one of our listeners here in Seattle, shout out Noelle, and she mentioned that she was on Spotify looking for the Mansplaining House Band and couldn't find anything there. And that seemed like such a great idea that we now have the Mansplaining House Band songs on Spotify and other less popular services. So in the show notes for this week, Joe will post a link to the Mansplaining channel on Spotify. And you can also find it on Spotify simply by searching Mansplaining. We're one of the first hits. So not every song is there because I confess I did not keep all of our songs. Some of those things are lost to posterity. But going forward, every song we feature in an episode will go up on the channel.
Yep. And let's give well-deserved kudos to the Mansplaining House Band, multi-talented musicians. It's really exciting to think that some of the songs from our podcast are going to be up on Spotify, which is where all my music lives these days.
Yeah. It'd be fun to see what happens with it. So with that, we will close. This is Mark, and that was Joe, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.
I'm spending more dough than I make. There's only so much I can take. What's a poor boy to do? They're repossessing my car. Can't run a tab at the bar. My days of careless spending are through. Save me, Lord, from my empty bank account. Save me from my evil spending ways. Help me, Jesus, to earn a decent amount and keep me from the end of days. I've saved nothing all my life, and I'm in financial strife. Where's a poor soul to turn? I can't even fix my teeth with all those cavities beneath. There's a special place in hell where I will burn. Save me, Lord, from my empty bank account. Save me from my evil spending ways. Help me, Jesus, to earn a decent amount and keep me from the end of days. God made heaven and earth and it was good. Was there something that I misunderstood? 'Cause ain't nothing going good for me. God gave me discount brains. Now I wear these fiscal chains and sing out you instead of ABC. Save me, Lord, from my empty bank account. Save me, Lord. Save me from my evil spending ways. I need a 401k. Help me, Jesus, to earn a decent amount and keep me from the end of days.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best way is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no faking, that would be uncool.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.